invited them here today. We're going to get some of the insights that they've done, particularly in research that was done last year, where they looked at the private rental market and both at tenants and landlords, which I think is really interesting, that we'll get a very balanced picture. Just as per usual housekeeping, we will be recording this, and you should get a notification there that says that giving us permission to record it. It'll go up on our YouTube channel, and we'll share a link to all the participants, and we'll share the slides as well. If you're going to tweet about it, please do, and use the hashtag #SimonTalks. And with that, I'm going to hand over to our two speakers. So our two speakers today are Caren Gallagher, who's Head of Communications and Research with the RTB. Before joining the RTB in 2017, Caren worked in the not-for-profit housing sector, and before that in social research. She has considerable experience in housing research and policy development, and holds an honours degree in geography from Queen's University Belfast and an MPhil examining urban social exclusion. Brian Gallwey has been working as a researcher for the Residential Tenancies Board since 2019. He currently manages the delivery of a number of research projects for the RTB, including the rental sector survey of landlords, tenants and letting agents, and the RTB Data Hub. Prior to joining the RTB, Brian worked as a researcher with the Dublin Region Homeless Executive, where he managed the biannual DRHE Rough Sleeping Count. Brian holds an honours degree in property economics and a master's in local and community development from TU Dublin, and a master's in regional and urban planning from the University College Dublin. Of all the mistakes to make. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Caren and Brian.
Thank you very much, Wayne. We are delighted to be here this morning and to take the opportunity to share some insights on the rental sector. We've a lot to get through and a lot of slides. We're not going to go into detail in all of the slides, but there's a lot of information there that we've provided, because the slides will be made available after the presentation. So we just wanted to take the opportunity to share the information that we have. So I'm going to go through the first part of the presentation to provide a little bit just about who we are, what we do, and our statutory functions as the regulator of the rental sector. I'm going to provide that legislative context just because it drives a lot of the information we collect and what we do in the regulatory space as well. I was going to go through then a snapshot of our registration data, how we're sharing our data, and how we want to grow that aspect of our data sharing as well, and then the RTB research programme. And after that, I'm going to hand over to Brian, who's going to take you through a deeper dive of some of the outputs of the research that is, as Wayne was saying, give I think a very comprehensive view and visibility of some of the issues and some of the trends in the rental sector. So just to start with, in terms of the RTB, so we're a public body set up in 2004, and I suppose we hang off the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act. That's a piece of legislation that established the RTB, and our core role is to support, develop and promote a well-functioning rental housing sector. So what does that mean? You can see there that we've got 5 core statutory areas there. So we operate the registration system on the tenancy registrations for private residential tenancies, for approved housing bodies, and most recently student-specific accommodation. And I'll talk a little bit about those 3 areas in a little while. I suppose the driver as well for the establishment of the RTB was to provide an alternative option than the courts to resolve landlord-tenant disputes as well. So a core part of the service we provide is that quasi-judicial dispute resolution service that is cheaper and speedier than a court option. And we also publish the research, as you'll hear today, and we are responsible for publishing a quarterly rent index as well, which monitors trends in the sector in rents across the country. And we've expanded that research program out to some of the outputs that you'll hear about today. A core part of what we do as well, in terms of my role as well, is that information and education. We have all of these regulatory statutory functions, and there's a lot of regulatory change that I will talk about that has happened since 2004, and I suppose that's only as effective if people know about it. So that's a core part of what we do, to provide that information to landlords, tenants, and the broad public as well on those rights and responsibilities. And most recently then as well, there were new regulatory powers given to the RTB to actively investigate non-compliance with the law and to issue administrative sanctions where they're justified. Sorry, just to hop on there. So yes, in terms of, I think it's important just then to look at what's under our remit and what's not. When we talk about regulation of the rental sector, we're looking at private residential tenancies, approved housing bodies tenancies, which came in 2016, and then student-specific accommodation. That's accommodation that's provided by higher education authorities, universities, and that purpose-built student-specific accommodation, and that's regardless whether there's a lease or a license in place. And most recently as well then, cost rental tenancies as well come under our remit. What doesn't come into the jurisdiction of the RTB are arrangements in the rent-a-room scheme. Where a dwelling is shared with a landlord, and then tenancies in local authority housing as well. They're not within our remit. And also short-term holiday lets or Airbnb don't come under the remit of the RTB. And it's just worth noting there on that short-term holiday lets, there is a commitment in Housing for All to develop new regulatory controls within that area for the registration of short-term lets with Fáilte Ireland. So that's just a more recent development there. In terms of the legislative content, I suppose I'm looking, or context, that I'm looking at this as in terms of how the legislation allows the RTB to collect data, to report on data, and just and how we've been using that data to report on the rental sector. So I suppose, as I mentioned, everything is driven by the Residential Tenancies Act, which has been amended a number of times since 2004. Landlords are required by law to register their tenancies. There's a form, a detailed form that they have to complete on the commencement of a tenancy, and there's a range of data fields in that. And Brian will pick up on some of this later as he's going through it. But that includes when the tenancy started, the address, the location, the type of property, number of bedrooms, what's the deposit that the landlord is charging, what is the building energy rating, and importantly as well, then what's the rent amount, what's the frequency of the rent, and there are a number of other fields collected. So that's really the bedrock in terms of the administrative data that we collect. And it's important, I think, just to make the distinction that it's the tenancies that are registered. It's not the properties, or it's not a license, or it's the tenancy. So that's what's registered, and that's the data that we report on. And currently, when you look at all of those under our remit, there's about 340,000 tenancies in the sector. And when you go back to our first annual report, that's grown from 84,000 tenancies that were reported in that first report. So that reflects that evolution of the sector as it's grown. As I say, there have been a number of changes to the regulatory framework, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this, but I think it's just important for to track some of that in terms of the 18 years in terms of how the role and the profile of the RTB has changed. That's reflective of the rental sector and some of the changes that have happened there, and some of the challenges as well that Wayne mentioned at the start. So since the RTB was established, and it was established as the PRTB, the rental sector has doubled in size. So, as I said before, that our remit has expanded, across the approved housing bodies and student specific, as well as cost rental, and as well as the changes to legislation involving controls for rents and new regulatory powers and investigations and sanctions. Some of those regulatory changes have also meant that a landlord has to notify the RTB they are issuing a notice of term for why that notice is being issued. So we collect data on that, and that's a really insightful track that we can look in terms of analysing those notices, and Brian will talk and go into some of the data on that later on. And we also collect data now when a landlord has to notify the RTB if there's a warning notice being issued for rent arrears as well. So again, for the first time, we're able to look at the issue of rent arrears in the sector and the extent to which that's an issue. So that's been a useful change, allowed us to really provide further insights and commentary on that. So those regulatory changes have meant that we're able to do that. In terms of, there's been a number of emergency legislation measures taken as well especially over the last 2 years, and that has allowed some of those that information to be collected, and importantly, and I leave this to Brian to go into as well. Annual registration is due to be commenced now on the 4th of April, and what that means is landlords must register their tenancy every year within 1 month of that the anniversary when that tenancy began, and that change applies to new and existing tenancies, and that's a game changer, to be honest, in terms of our data. So that will mean that we will have the ability to report and track and monitor the entirety of the sector as well. Before that, tenancies were being registered, on a 4 and a 6 year cycle. So that was a constraint in terms of our ability to I suppose to kind of give that sort of full visibility and that information that gives the full picture. I think it's just worth noticing mentioning as well. If you notice there, the rent pressure zone, that this is probably one of the biggest changes in the sector in terms of the regulatory change. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in relation to this, but I suppose the rent pressure zone, as many will know, but as we know from our data, not everyone knows that the rent pressure zone is a designated area where rents cannot exceed general inflation, and the recent change to that is that inflation is as recorded by the harmonised index of the consumer price, or 2% per year pro rata. Even saying that sentence as well is complex, and in terms of how that applies to new and existing tenancies. And that rent pressure zone legislation has been in place since 2016 is when it was initiated, in terms of designating specific areas of the country within these rent controls. It's evolved over the years and changed in 2019 and then 2021 as the kind of affordability challenges have become more acute. So in this space as well, I suppose there is an issue about awareness, and the rental sector survey that we carried out showed us that the majority of landlords know what a rent pressure zone is. Like, I think it was about 85%, but tenants have a 41% awareness. 41% of tenants were aware of rent pressure zones. And when I sort of put my communications hat on, there's obviously a challenge for us there. Our direct contact is with the landlords, because it's their legal responsibility to register with us, and reaching tenants is very much our priority to make sure that everyone is aware of those I suppose of those regulations that will allow them to make sure they have a certainty about their rent and what they can and cannot be charged in the course of their tenancy. And at the moment, through the course of since 2016, 6 local authority areas have been designated as rent pressure zones and 49 local electoral areas. So if you look at this map now, there are about 75% of tenancies registered with the RTB are in a rent pressure zone. So that's that's a significant proportion of the tenancies, and they're concentrated in the areas as you would expect in terms of that, the urban areas there. I mentioned the emergency legislation, and I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I suppose, again, when we think about, as Wayne was saying, you know, understanding the sector and thinking about what's happening in the sector, both from a landlord, tenant, agent, other stakeholders view, like this is another reflection of, I suppose, how the legislative framework has changed again. This was obviously in response to the public health emergency at the time, and there's been a number of changes. This is the piece in terms of the Residential Tenancies Evaluation Act that made it a requirement for landlords to inform the RTB and where there were warning notices being issued for rent arrears. But I suppose the immediate priority is for the RTB is implementing this legislation, and then obviously tracking where we can the impact of that legislation, and obviously making sure that everyone knows what their rights and responsibilities are within that regulatory framework. I suppose it's worth saying as well that, you know, kind of just because of the evolving nature of the pandemic and the need for supports for the rental sector, there's been 6 pieces of legislation affecting the RTB and the rental sector between 2020 and 2021. So it can be, I suppose, it's making sure that everyone's aware of those changes and the protections that are being afforded them. I just want to give a very quick snapshot of the registration data that we hold. As I say, this goes back to sort of that landlord requirement to register in the data we collect there. So you can see there, this goes to the end of 2020, and excuse me, we're just finalising the registration data for 2021. But in terms of the trends there, you can see when we look at each area individually there, the number of approved housing body tenancies registered with the RTB has grown since I suppose they came onto the RTB in 2016. You can see there, and that reflects the development activity, the development programs that would be taking place to expand and the sector. And in terms of student-specific accommodation, that came in 2019. Now you can see there that dropped significantly. Now it's important to point out as well that this is a point in time. So if we looked at the student-specific numbers, there may be a slight increase in the 2020 figures, you know, for a variety of reasons and late registrations and other elements in terms of registration, but that is reflective of the impact of COVID and that the changes that would have happened there in terms of student-specific accommodation. And you can see there in terms of the number of private rented tenancies that's tracked from 2017. But if we look here in this graph, this can illustrate, I suppose, that there is that consistent decline year on year since 2016. And Brian will talk a little bit more about why we're finding that is according to the survey that we've carried out. In terms of where tenancies are located, you can see there that there is a very high concentration, higher concentration in the urban areas. We know about 40% of tenancies are in Dublin, which reflects that sort of urban concentration. And really, when you think about it, like, and we see the rental trends in Dublin, and Brian will talk to that in terms of the rent index data that we have. Dublin is in itself, it's, you know, a separate market in terms of its the rent inflation levels and the nature and the type of the accommodation that's available there, and the tenancies that are there as well. So it's very much a Dublin that sort of rental sector behaves differently than other areas, but you can see there that's kind of where the tenancies are located. And what I had meant to do and didn't was, if you set the rent pressure zone map beside this as well, you can see that there's a broad reflection there in terms of like where the concentrations of tenancies are, and then where rent pressure zone designations have been. In terms of our data sharing, I suppose the communications and research section of the RTB has been in existence since 2017, and we've been building up our research programme. part of our research objectives are to share our data. Now that's part of the Open Data Directive, and I suppose strategically in terms of, you know, making public data that's available openly and available and accessible. So we are very keen to share our data because it opens up opportunities for, you know, further research, learning and insights. And I suppose it's important to note in doing so, we share the data in a way obviously that doesn't compromise privacy and respects confidentiality. And in terms of the integrity of data, you know, we'd be very much, you know, making sure the principles are upheld in relation to sort of sharing that data. And we have shared with other public bodies, with not-for-profit organizations, students, universities, and, you know, we're individuals as well who are carrying out research. And I suppose this allows additional and interesting analysis in terms of matching our data with other data sets as well, that definitely provides additional insights to that obviously then will inform policy and the sector. So you can see there we've undertaken a number of projects with the Central Statistics Office, the Housing Agency and the Central Bank of Ireland. And just a couple to call out was the 2021 report that was carried out by the Central Statistics Office. There was a number of reports published in the private rental sector, and I think Brian actually has the link in one of his slides as well, because it's well worth a look in terms of another insight. One of the elements that I thought was worth mentioning today was when the RTB tenancy data was matched to BER certs to provide an overview of the energy rating. And what we can see there is that there was a higher BER rating than in general housing than the rental sector. So 40% of the matched active tenancies had a C energy rating according to the BER certificate. So, you know, very few rental properties had a rating of A, and I suppose that definitely reflects maybe some of the I suppose whether there's older stock, whether there's issues with minimum standards, and, you know, kind of I suppose that overall energy efficiency question in the rental sector. And there's a bigger question, you know, in relation to then obviously trying to improve the energy efficiency of the rental stock over time. Another study that I might just mention in passing again was a 2019 study where again the housing assistant payment data was matched to the RTB data, and again that's on the CSO website, and we can provide the link. And that gave interesting insights as well in terms of the number of tenancies that were in receipt of HAP. I think it was 1/3 of tenancies in receipt of HAP, and different concentrations in different areas. Where there were very high concentrations where the tenancy where the tenants were in receipt of HAP, and one in particular was very high concentration in Louth. But again, that's another study worth looking at. But this, I suppose the reason I'm mentioning this as well is because this is just a snapshot of where the data is shared out, then that it contributes to sort of to that learning and insights. So in terms of our own research program, I've touched on a few of the elements that I suppose there's three main pillars. We provide a quarterly rent index which examines rent levels in the sector for new tenancies and renewed tenancies. And Brian's going to go into a bit more detail both in terms of the two pillars, the rent index and the rental sector survey, which was published last year. And the other element, and I suppose it links back to my point on the data sharing, is the research and data hub. All of the data that I've talked about, the majority of it has been made available in the research and data hub. And again, that's we're trying to make sure that the information that we have is accessible and informative, and given that there's information on a lot of areas, and in the data that's available to download. It contains interactive charts, and Brian will be pulling out some of that data to talk to specifically in his part of the presentation. So you can see there the breadth of the data, and we're continuing to build on the research and data hub as we go forward. And I suppose we're continually improving on the research program as well. But I hope that's given an insight, I suppose, and a bit of context to Brian's presentation as well, because he's going to give a deeper dive into the some of the research that we have carried out. Thank you. And Brian, I'll hand over to you.
Sorry, 1 second, guys. I'm just setting it up here. Okay, so. Okay, so for the second half of the presentation, I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of some of our research and data that we have available on our Research and Data Hub and that we've conducted over the last number of years. I picked some specific areas that I thought would be of particular interest to for this particular presentation. So we're going to look at rent levels in the private rented sector, then focus on tenants in the private rented sector, taking information from our tenants research that we published last year. I'll touch on rent arrears, notices of termination, so reasons why tenancies are ending, the changing shape of the private rented sector, so that's looking at landlords, small landlords, medium landlords, and large landlords, and then also the future data developments that the RTB has coming down the line. So before I do that, I'll talk about the source of information. So where do we get our information from? So most of our information is gathered through the RTB fulfilling its statutory functions. So this includes the registration of tenancies. So from that, we get information on rent levels, where tenancies are, the type of dwellings, and so on and so forth. We also get information through our dispute resolution service, the notice of terminations received by the RTB, but I suppose the administrative information doesn't give us everything, or there are gaps in our knowledge of the sector. So in 2021, we did publish information on the rental sector through surveys and interviews we conducted with landlords and tenants and letting agents. So where this information, I suppose, plugs those knowledge gaps that we had from our administrative data. So between those sources, the following slides are based on the information from them. Starting off just on rent levels in the private rented sector. The RTB produces a rent index. This is produced in collaboration with the ESRI. And the purpose of the rent index is to measure rental price developments in new tenancies in the private rented sector. And the distinction of new tenancies is very important. So the rent index includes information, it was based on new tenancies registered with the RTB, which includes new tenancies never let before in existing rental properties, new tenancies in existing rental properties, and new tenancies in properties that have not been let in the immediate 2 years prior to that tenancy. It does not provide a measure of rental prices faced by existing tenants, and that is the really important distinction. However, as Caren mentioned, we have annual registration coming in on the 4th of April. And with that, we're going to be getting a lot more information. So we'll go from having, just the new tenancies being registered with the RTB on every year to every single tenancy, so new and existing tenancies, all stock being registered with the RTB over the course of the year. And this will allow us to, over time, look at price developments for existing stock as well as new tenancies. It will, of course, take at least a year after the introduction of annual registration before we'll be able to report on this publicly. If we look then at the most recent rent index, so this is based on new tenancies. At the time, we have less than 16,000 tenancies registered with us in that particular quarter, and that's one of the lowest number of registrations we had in a single quarter. You also see that there's significant regional differences, which Caren touched on. So differences between the rent levels in Dublin, where it's over 1,900, to outside the GDA, where it's just less than 1,100. If you're looking at a 3-bedroom property as well, the differences are very significant as well, where in Dublin, the price is 2,161 for a 3-bed property, where the standardized average rent outside of Dublin is over 1,000 euros less. If we look at then the evolution of rents over time, right now we're at a point where rents are higher than they've ever been. So we're at a peak at the moment where rents are just under 1,400 euros. The previous peak happened during the Celtic Tiger, so in 2008, and it was almost 400 euros less at that point in time. So rents are rising, and they are rising fast. At the last quarter, the year-on-year percentage change was over 8%. And looking forward, we hope to be publishing the Q4 rent index in the coming months as well. Moving away from our administrative data and looking at our information we gathered through our rental sector surveys, then this information was gathered prior to the pandemic, so it was gathered in 2019 and gathered in 2020, just before the pandemic hit, and we published it in 2021. We employed like a mixed mode methodology, so quantitative and qualitative. We undertook a representative survey of tenants living in the private rented sector. This was done face-to-face at 130 sampling points across the country. And we also undertook 5 thematic focus groups. So we spoke to older tenants living in the private rented sector, or non-Irish nationals, and so on. I then wanted to focus just on some of the key elements from these reports. The report itself has 150 pages, so I'm just touching on some elements that I felt would be of most interest at this particular talk today. The first one is information on rental assistance. So approximately 1 in 5 of the tenants surveyed indicated that they were in receipt of some sort of rental assistance. And this is higher in older renters and in renters that have been renting for more than 5 years. What's also interesting here is that 66%, so 2/3 of tenants surveyed, indicated that they were paying a top up directly to their landlord on top of the rental assistance that they were being provided by the state. Another interesting point, and this is information that we can't get or couldn't get from our tenancy database, is the length of time people have been renting. The survey showed that 81% of the tenants that we spoke to had been renting for more than a year, and the average length was 5 years. Most interesting, I suppose, is the average length of tenants who have been renting their current property was 3.8 years. So that means the tenants are staying in properties for long periods of time, which I suppose is understandable given the current climate. And also the average number of properties that tenants have been living in is 2.3. We also looked at rent and affordability. So we asked tenants the proportion of their net income that they were paying on rent each month, and the average amount of net income that they were paying each month was 36%. However, this was higher in Dublin, so that goes back to the regional divide that we've seen. We also see that 50% of tenants indicated that they were paying 30% or less of their income on rent every month. While at the other end, you had 12% who were paying more than 50% of their income on rent each month. We also wanted to know what the tenants' future intentions were. And interestingly enough, 2/3 of the tenants indicated that they felt renting was a transitional arrangement, with half expecting to be owner-occupiers in 10 years' time. If we look just at 12 months where they expected to be, we see that 84% still felt they'd be renting in a house or apartment in the private rented sector in 12 months' time. While just 6% felt they'd be an owner-occupier in a house, and you had 4% felt they'd be renting from a local authority. In 5 years' time, this shifts a little bit, where you have 49% of individuals felt they'd be living in the private rented sector, and you can see the proportion that felt they'd be owner-occupiers at that point in time has increased, as well as the proportion that felt they'd be renting from a local authority or AHB has increased. If you fast forward 10 years to 10 years, it moves the majority of tenants believe they'd be owner-occupiers either in a house or an apartment at that stage. You had a proportion as well that thought they'd be renting from a local authority or AHB, that's 11%, but you still had a significant proportion that felt they'd be renting in the private rented sector in 10 years' time. Moving on then to rent arrears, and this again moves back to our administrative data that we gather in the RTB. If a landlord wants to end a tenancy because of rent arrears, they must follow a 6-step process to do so. As a part of this process, they must provide the tenant with, or issue the tenant with, a 28-day warning notice for rent arrears, and they must send a copy of this warning notice into the RTB. And failure to submit a copy of this warning notice to the RTB does invalidate that notice of termination. So since this came in, the RTB, between August 2020 and January 2022, the RTB has received over 7,000 of these warning notices, which is significant. And this does provide us information on rent arrears that we had never had before. So because certain information is included on these warning notices, such as the rent frequency, the rent amount, and the total rent arrears, we're able to do an analysis of the data. So this is showing that you have 45% of these tenants on the warning notices were in arrears for up to 1 month, while just 4% were in arrears for longer than a year. And again, this is information we've never been able to have before prior to this. The chart here is based on that entire period from August 2020 to January 2022. So all of those were warning notices received by the RTB. So it's point in time when they were received by the RTB. We also see that the median length of time that people were in arrears is 1.3 months. In Dublin, that's 1 month. And the median rent arrears amount was found to be 1,452. That's among this 7,000, this group of 7,000 warning notices. In Dublin, the median rent amount was found to be higher at 1,656. So again, this is information we just never had before. It gives really interesting insights into levels of rent arrears happening in the state. If we move on to notices of termination, so again, this is administrative data collected by the RTB. Legislation was brought in 2019 that requires the landlord to send in a copy of the notice of termination to the RTB within 28 days of the tenancy ending. And so far, we've had over 5,500 NOTs received by the RTB. This chart here demonstrates when the RTB received the notice. It's not when the notice was actually issued to the tenants. So that's an important distinction to make. It's also important to note that in Q4, this is the highest number of NOTs we received in a single quarter occurred in Q4. Well, why are landlords issuing these NOTs is a question then, I suppose. So first off, we've had over 5,500 of these NOTs since 2019, and the numbers are increasing, I suppose, month on month quarter on quarter. In the last 3 quarters, they're steadily increasing. But why are landlords issuing them? So the third most common reason for a landlord issuing a notice was the breach of tenant obligation. So this can include something like rent arrears. The second most common reason for a landlord issuing a notice of termination was because the landlord intended to use the property for themselves or for family members' use. And by a significant amount, the largest or the most common reason for issuing a notice of termination was because a landlord intended to sell the property. And we'll see this again later on in other data as well that I talk about. So just moving on to the changing shape of the rental sector then. So this information, the private rental sector is changing in terms of the provision of private rental tenancies. And we see that in our own data. So small landlords, I suppose, in 2019, they accounted for 53.46% of tenancies, whereas in 2021, it was 53.31. So it's a very small reduction in the proportion of tenancies provided by small landlords. In terms of large landlords then, they're increasing the proportion of tenancies provided in the sector. So it's gone from like 4.87% up to 5.79%. So almost a percentage increase in that 2-year period. Well, it is small, it is significant, and it is happening slowly over time. So to delve into small landlords a little bit more now, we did undertake research with them, which we published in 2021. We surveyed 500 small landlords about the private rental sector. We also surveyed 74 who had left the sector and 66 who had recently expanded their portfolios and were no longer, small landlords with 1 or 2 tenancies. What's very interesting about the small landlords is that the majority of them acquire their properties with owner-occupied mortgages, and a very small proportion, so 20%, 1 in 5, acquire their properties with a buy-to-let mortgage. So the indication there is the majority acquire the property with the intention to live in the property themselves and not with the initial intention to rent the property out. And we did ask small landlords the likelihood they were to sell a property, what the likelihood was for them to sell a property in 12 months, 2 years, and 5 years. And we found that 9% felt that they were going to sell a property within the next year. When we excluded that 9%, 7% of the remaining indicated they would sell not next year, within the next 2 years. and we excluded that 7%, 10% of the remaining felt they would sell a property in the next 5 years. So a significant proportion, almost a quarter of these small landlords, did indicate that they did plan to sell a property within the next 5 years. And if you consider the proportion of tenancies that these small landlords are associated with, that is a significant proportion of tenancies in the sector. If you look at then reasons why small landlords have exited the sector, so we spoke to 74 small landlords who had recently exited the private rental sector. The reasons, what happened to the rental properties? So this kind of tracks with the NOTs that we received as well. So almost 72% of them indicated that they sold the properties, 23% indicated that they recovered the properties for their own use, so their use by a family member. We asked why they decided no longer to be a landlord, and the vast majority of them indicated that they simply didn't want to be a landlord anymore. Some also indicated that it wasn't profitable for them, and some said they were no longer in negative equity. And we asked what would make them reconsider, and again, the vast majority said nothing. They wanted to sell for personal reasons. However, a small proportion did indicate that greater profit, less taxation, or less unfavorable regulation would perhaps help them change their mind. So this kind of does, if you consider that a lot of these landlords, the majority of these landlords, didn't actually purchase the property with the intention to let it out, it is understandable to see that there might not be a lot that can be done to stop them from leaving the sector now. If we move on to medium landlords, we conducted research of medium landlords as well. So there's obviously a lot less medium landlords. Medium landlords, for this part of the research, we consider to have between 3 and 20 tenancies. We spoke to 250 of them, and just looking at their future intentions, 38% of them said it was likely or very likely that they would sell a property within the next 5 years. Which is again higher than the smaller landlords, but again they would have more properties to dispose of. While on the opposite side of things, 17% of them did say that they plan to buy more properties. So while some are planning on leaving, it is clear that also some are planning to expand their portfolios. If we look at large landlords then as well, in large landlords, we consider to be landlords that have 100 or more tenancies. There are less than 70 of these large landlords in the sector, according to our data. And we surveyed 10 of them, so a significant proportion of them, and asked them about, loads of issues, but one of them was their future intentions in the sector. And it really, the results showed that while like small landlords and medium landlords did plan to, sell properties in the near future, larger landlords did have intentions to invest and to continue to invest in the near to medium future in Dublin and in Ireland, which I think is very interesting. So it's in contrast to the smaller and medium landlords. If you look at future RTB data developments then as well, the most significant development is annual registration. So that's coming in on the 4th of April 2022. And that will mean, as I said, every single tenancy will have to be registered with us every year, and that will mean we'll have so much more access to more up-to-date information on the private rental sector and be able to provide a greater level of analysis on the sector too. So some of the future developments are also going to be facilitated by the new system that we introduced. So the new system was launched in 2020, and that system means that tenancies are air code matched and verified at the point of registration. Landlords have their PPSN matched and verified at the point of registration, and the CRO numbers as well for company landlords. So some of the things we will be able to do then will be that we'll be able to identify new stock that hasn't been let before in the sector, identify rent levels in existing stock, and monitor important tenancy duration. And just then in conclusion, Caren talked about earlier on about tenancy numbers have been falling in recent years, and we can see that in our data. Our rent index shows that rent levels have steadily increased across the country. They're at their highest point ever at the moment. Our rental sector survey shows that affordability remains a significant issue for tenants, with the average tenant paying 36% of the net income on rent. And in tenants, then I suppose their aspirations are in the long term for home ownership. And then in terms of landlords, you see that while small and medium landlords might have intentions some might have intentions to leave the sector in the short to medium term, larger landlords do have intentions to expand their portfolio. And that's kind of my whistle-stop tour of our data. All of this information is available on our Data Hub website. And there's, in terms of those rental sector survey reports, there's 6 reports in total available to download and to read. So that is, I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Okay. If Caren, she's there as well. So the first thing to say is, wow, thanks very much for that, guys. That's a real whistle-stop tour of a huge amount of information, but it's all really useful and really interesting stuff. And I see questions are already starting to come in. So our first, and so just to say, I did put it in, but if people do have questions, if you pop them into the chat, I'll ask the guys, and we'll also, if we don't get to everything, we'll also follow up perhaps and with provide more information as we go. So the 4 questions are from initial questions are from Ona Bryn, TD, and they're all good questions. So I'm just going to run through them with you. The first one is, which I think is for Brian, is does the RTB rent index not include any existing tenancies rent data?
Yeah, so the index is based on new tenancies registered in a quarter. Okay, so when we talk about, the Q3 rent index, it's based on those tenancies that commenced in that particular quarter and the rent levels for those tenancies. Now, previously we would have had renewal tenancies as well in our data, but because of changes to Part 4 tenancies that occurred in 2016, it means there are no renewals at the moment, because they moved from 4 years to 6 years. So we have a current gap where we're not getting any renewals. So we removed all the renewals from the whole index to allow the quarters to be comparable. So at the moment it's based on new tenancies only, but once we have annual registration and so on, it'll be based on new and renewal, and we will be introducing that as well.
Okay, but will you be separating them as a
we're still in talks with the ESRI about how best to do this, and we'll be following the approach that they suggest how best to do it. Okay. So
was the sample size for future tenant intentions weighted to reflect the 30% of private rented sector that are HAP or rent supplement tenancies?
No, it was not. No.
Okay, so it was just you got 1,000 renters, but I think it was about 17%, wasn't it? It was captured. I'm working off memory of the slide, but
in total there was 19%, I think it was. Yeah. Okay. But we think that's underrepresented as well, by the way. We think there is a higher proportion of people in receipt of rental assistance in the sector, just from other sources like the CSO research that Caren mentioned earlier on, where they linked our data to the HAP data. It just showed a higher proportion of tenancies. So we do think that was underrepresented, and it's something we're going to look at when we're sampling for the next iteration, which we're going to do this year.
Okay. When will the 2021 registered tenancies data be published?
So this is something, again, we're working on, and we're hoping to have something published within the next month or so. There's just obviously been a few issues with moving over to the new system and so on and so forth, but I'm hoping it'll be within a few weeks. Really, we had hoped to have it by the end of Q1, but I'm hoping if it's not by the end of Q1, it'll be the week or so after that.
Okay. And do we have any inflow and outflow data of registered tenancies? This is a policy one question, to get gross and net changes. I like that one. Sorry, Brian.
Sorry, it's okay. It's okay. Drink of water. So at the moment we don't, our old system didn't have the capabilities for us to monitor that properly. However, this new system, it has all of these new capabilities. We have new kind of tools to analyze the data, and because the data will be verified at the point of registration, everything will be air code matched. The landlords will also be verified, so there won't be any kind of duplication at all in this, which will mean that we will be able to start reproducing things like that. But it wasn't possible in our previous system. but it is, the future is bright with annual registrations.
And I think, Wayne, it's also just worth mentioning as well that it's once annual registration is commenced, this will take time to there's going to be a cumulative, it's on the registration for each tenancy that a landlord has takes place on the anniversary of the commencement of that tenancy. So that data, you know, from the 4th of April will accumulate over time. But these are the types of things, and these are the exact questions that we haven't been able to answer before, that we will absolutely be looking to provide information on, and again, making that data available.
So just again, Owen has come back into it, and I think this is a follow on from the 30% question about whether it skews the results, because it would be great to get a gross loss. Oh, sorry, this is the last question. It would be great to get a gross loss of properties from the semi-professional and accidentals versus gross gain of new build and build to rent, etc., rental properties. So that's essentially carrying that out.
Yeah, it's in training.
Well. Yeah, just in terms of the 30% private rental with HAP and rent supplement. Is that are you concerned that because you're not that's not captured in it, does that skew sort of the understanding of the private rental sector in terms of that? Is that something you're going to chase after, or maybe that there's a piece of work to be done on that group to better understand their interaction with the private rental market?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, we are going to look at it again in more detail for the next iteration. So this year we'll be looking at it in closer detail.
I want to get to, there's loads of questions coming in here, which is great. So the next one is from Sarah Sheridan, who asked, really impressive research program in the RTB with regard to the data on rent arrears. Have there been any discussions on the possibility of targeting homeless prevention measures and support to the 7,033 tenants who are recorded as being in rent arrears? And in addition to that, I was struck by how many of the notice to quits were served with only 1 month's, which they're perfectly entitled to do, by the way, as a private rental landlord, but at the point of 1 month's arrears. And I'm just wondering, are you tracking how much of that is perhaps resolved? Are landlords using the fact that they can serve a notice to quit on arrears to sort of say, look, this is the consequence of not paying your rent. So at 1 month, it's a sort of something they trigger. But if the person then catches up, is it being reversed? And is that kind of those dynamics within that, is that being captured yet, or is it possible to capture it?
It's not being captured yet in that way, I suppose. And to your point about, is this like we would, in terms of that sort of communication piece, for if there's an issue with rent arrears that it needs to be, dealt with early, that, the landlord and tenant should communicate with each other. So often a landlord will issue a warning notice, because that's what it is, do you know what I mean, that warning notice to tenants. And then the legislation that was brought in does trigger some, that link in with the money advice budgeting service as well. And a tenant then also can, that's in that really detailed slide as well, because a tenant can also self-declare as well. And in that was in the emergency legislation at that time. So there are mechanisms. I think it was to the question that that was mentioned before about intervention. There are mechanisms that do trigger that link with MABs as well. And that was something I think that was very positive, in that sort of emergency legislation period as well.
Okay. And was there an evaluation of the effectiveness of that?
We have quarterly meetings with MABs as well, because obviously there were referrals going across, so they would have reported, kind of, we would have had that kind of communication about some tenants. It was all about the intention to sustain the tenancy, and there were plans put in place. I don't have numbers for you, but it's definitely something that we probably will kind of look to kind of present at some point as well. What was the impact of that intervention? But there definitely were resolutions, let's put it that way, and arrangements made through the support of MABs with the tenants and landlords. And
we have another question here from Carly Bailey, who's a counsellor in. So the Thoughts on the level of landlords who've given notice to quit contrast to the actual number of rental tenancies being sold? Obviously, data is from a sample, but it would seem that the numbers perhaps not match. Would this suggest that potentially some landlords are evicting tenants, but not always selling up? Thoughts also on the level of burden on tenants to take a case when they believe the landlord has actually sold up as stated for the rationale for the notice to quit. Do you have any data to hand that could tell us the number of cases taken for this reason? Does the affordability figure of 30%, 6% include top-ups paid directly to landlords by those in receipt of the HAP rent supplement? So is there, I suppose that feeds into that question of, was there any sort of separation or examination, particularly of those people who are on HAP or rent supplement? But
yeah,
the first question is in relation to landlords selling up.
Well, I'll just take the second one first, and I'll see if Caren wants to talk with the first one. But that 36%, there was no separation. We just asked them what proportion of their net income. So, you know, there could be a the ones that were paying a lower proportion, perhaps the ones on HAP and so on and so forth. But all that data, we are working to make it available publicly, so the entire data set. And so other researchers can go in or will be able to go in. We're at the moment we're in the process of getting it cleaned and ready to upload. So other people will be able to go in and cross tabulate different things to interrogate it in different ways. And we want to do that with our landlord research as well. So other people they might have other research questions that they might want to answer, or other areas that they want to focus on. That will be allowable going forward. And then in terms of the other question, it was to do with NOTs and landlords not selling up. So this is something that, we have done some kind of work in it, but it's not at a phase that I'd be able to give any kind of data out on. But we have done some work on looking at this to see if properties have been sold and so on. Obviously, landlords have they've 9 months after the end of a tenancy to sell the property, and then the properties do take some time to go onto the property price register and so on and so forth. So it's not a speedy process for us to look at it, but I have been looking at it from a research perspective. We hope to have some kind of findings at some point this year, but it's not ready to be put out there.
And I might just add to that as well, that in terms of the investigation, so in relation to the new PARs, and I think the point about potentially like a tenant then kind of taking that case or raising that issue, and one of the, I suppose, the intentions of the new PARs investigation and sanction are that the RTB can proactively do that, so that concern of improper conduct can be brought to the RTB anonymously, and the RTB can then investigate. And I just was grabbing my figures there. So at the end of 2020, there was 245 investigations into the alleged improper conduct. But in 2020, the main driver for that of the investigations was for raising the rent above the rent pressure zone levels. But there were a smaller proportion that the category would be sort of false or misleading reason. So if the landlord said that they intended to sell the property and then did not, or if they failed to offer the property back. So those were the three sort of categories as well as non-registration in the 2020 data there. But yeah, it is something that the RTB would proactively and can proactively do on a tenant's behalf.
Thanks, Caren. That's really useful additional data to know. Carly had an additional question on getting the more accurate data, but I think, Brian, you've mentioned that it'll be a year from whence the yearly registration comes in. So there's a year lag at which point we should get more information. But there was a second question about, is there any sense of the number of unregistered tenancies? The unknowable.
Yeah, exactly, the unknowable. I don't know if Caren, you want to take this. The only thing I'd say is the census next year is going to obviously give us a good indicator. So that obviously is happening later in April, I think it's happening. So and the results will probably be published from the census in a year's time. And when you compare that to our tenancy database at that point in time, I think that will be an indicator as to if there is levels of unregistered tenancies or not.
So I think we're exactly, or maybe 1 minute over our hour. So I just want to thank Caren and Brian profusely for pulling together all this information and presenting it so succinctly. It's really well done, a really interesting session. I've had a great, I'd say Owen also mentioned that it'd be great to get the slides, and I think everyone would agree with that. So we will circulate the slides with your permission to all of the participants. And as I say, the presentation itself will be up and we'll provide a link to all those who attended as well. So with that, I just want to thank Caren and Brian again, and to all of you who came along, and do continue to tweet and let people know, and do sign up for our future Simon Talks. Our next one is with Lorcan Sir, who's going to talk about sort of the parts of the housing system that we don't get to talk about enough, or the impact of the housing system that we don't talk about enough, but more about that anon. So thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks to Caren and Brian, and we'll see you all again soon.